The Zenith Combat Academy occupied a space station the size of a small moon, which seemed appropriate considering the egos it housed. Floating in the neutral zone between 12 different star systems, it served as the premier training ground for the galaxy's military elite. A place where the children of generals, the spawn of warlords, and the occasional democratically selected specimen came to learn the ancient art of making other beings regret their life choices. The Academy's reputation had been built over 3 centuries on a simple principle. Take the most physically capable species in known space, throw them together in controlled violence, and see who emerged with the fewest broken bones and the most inflated sense of superiority. It was, by all accounts, a system that worked beautifully for everyone involved. Assuming you didn't count the medical bills or the interspecies incident reports that could fill a small library. What made Zenith particularly fascinating to anthropologists and betting rings alike was its strict adherence to species-based hierarchical assumptions. At the top of this food chain sat the Vortheim, 7-foot-tall apex predators from a high-gravity world who could bench press a shuttle and had reflexes that made cobras look sluggish. Just below them prowled the Kresh, insectoid warriors with exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire and a cultural appreciation for ritualized combat that bordered on religious fervor. Then came the Talvek, the Grishnar, the Felox, each species slotting neatly into their predetermined position based on bone density, muscle fiber composition, and how intimidating they looked in armor. It was a beautifully organized system that made everyone comfortable with their place in the universe. And at the very bottom, handling administrative duties, running logistics, and generally being useful in non-threatening ways, were the humans. Humanity had joined the galactic community roughly 80 years ago, arriving with their curious habit of smiling at inappropriate times and their bizarre insistence on putting ice in beverages. The initial assessment had been swift and, the assessors believed, accurate. Humans were soft, slow, and catastrophically fragile by galactic standards. They bruised if you looked at them wrong, broke bones doing recreational activities, and had the ridiculous ability to die from tripping over their own feet. Naturally, they were assigned to logistics and diplomacy, where their peculiar talent for organization and their unsettling ability to keep smiling while being insulted made them surprisingly effective. Everyone agreed this was the best use of humanity's limited capabilities. The fact that humans didn't argue the point only confirmed the assessment. Which brought us to Training Hall 7 on a standard rotation morning, where Corporal Thane Kovac was discovering that sometimes the galaxy's assumptions needed percussive maintenance. Thane stood about 5'6" in her training boots, with dark hair pulled into a regulation bun and the kind of unremarkable features that made people forget her face 5 minutes after meeting her. She had the lean build common to humans who spent time in zero-G rotations, and the calm expression of someone who had long since stopped trying to correct other people's misconceptions. At 26 standard years, she'd been with the Orbital Defense Corps for 4 years, which made her practically ancient by human military standards and laughably young by everyone else's. She was also, technically, the first human to ever attend Zenith's Advanced Combat Certification program, though she suspected this had more to do with filling diversity quotas than any real respect for human martial capability. Across the training mat stood Kryn Vash, and if Thane was unremarkable, Kryn was the exact opposite. He towered at 7'3", with the distinctive ridged skull and amber eyes of the Vortheim. His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway, his arms corded with muscle that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting. And his expression carried the particular smugness of someone who had never lost a fight and couldn't imagine a universe where such a thing was possible. He was also 22, a decorated champion in 3 different martial disciplines. and possessed the kind of arrogance that could be detected from orbit. "You're joking." Kryn's voice rumbled like distant thunder, a neat trick the Vortheim had evolved to intimidate prey. He stared at Instructor Vex, a grizzled Talvek whose scales bore scars from 40 years of combat training. "You want me to spar with the human?" Instructor Vex's eye stalks swiveled independently, a biological middle finger that the Talvek had perfected over millennia. "I want you to spar with Corporal Kovac, yes. Unless you're suggesting your skills are insufficient to adjust for a less experienced opponent?" The challenge in those words was clear enough that even the dozen other students spread around the training hall picked up on it. A Kresh named Tillich clicked his mandibles in amusement. Two Grishnar females exchanged knowing looks. Everyone understood the game being played. Kryn's jaw tightened. "My skills are fine, Instructor. I'm concerned about injuring her. Humans are fragile." "How considerate." Thane spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the flat accent of Earth's northern territories. "I promise to try not to bleed on your uniform when you accidentally break me." Several students made sounds that might have been laughter in their respective species. Kryn's amber eyes narrowed, reassessing the small human with the posture of someone who spent too much time at a desk. He saw no threat there, which was his first mistake. "Very well." Kryn rolled his massive shoulders, joints popping like gunfire. "I'll be gentle." "How romantic," Thane said, stepping onto the mat. The training mat was a regulation, 60-foot square of impact-absorbing composite, designed to withstand the punishment of species that could crack stone with their bare hands. Around its perimeter, holographic barriers shimmered, ready to deploy if anyone got thrown beyond the boundaries. The ceiling arched 30 feet overhead, dotted with medical drones that looked like flying dinner plates with too many good intentions. Instructor Vex moved to the edge of the mat, his voice amplified by the hall's acoustics. "Standard sparring rules. Match ends at first solid impact, submission, or ring out. Lethal techniques are prohibited. Medical drones are active. Combatants, acknowledge." "Acknowledged," Kryn said, settling into a Vortheim combat stance that looked like a controlled avalanche waiting to happen. "Acknowledged," Thane replied, adopting a loose posture that Kryn immediately recognized as the human military's basic ready position, essentially standing upright with hands raised. Adorable. "Begin." Kryn moved first, because of course he did. His approach was casual, almost contemptuous. A few steps forward, his guard loose, clearly expecting this to be over in seconds. The other students watched with varying degrees of interest. Tillich had actually started a countdown in his native language, betting on how quickly the human would fold. To her credit, Thane didn't immediately retreat or show fear, which Kryn found mildly interesting. She maintained her position, weight balanced, watching him with dark eyes that tracked his movement without apparent concern. Most opponents showed some reaction to his approach, a tensing of muscles, a shift in breathing, the biological recognition that a predator was closing distance. The human just stood there like she was waiting for a transit shuttle. Kryn decided to make this quick and educational. He'd give her a light push, demonstrate the gulf in their physical capabilities, and end this farce before anyone got hurt. It was the professional thing to do. The kind thing, even. He reached out with one massive hand, fingers spread, and shoved her shoulder with roughly the same force he'd used to move a piece of furniture. Thane stumbled backward 3 steps, arms windmilling slightly for balance. She didn't fall, but it was close. Around the mat, a few students chuckled. Kryn allowed himself a small smile, already turning away to signal Instructor Vex that this was pointless. The human moved. Later, when Kryn had time to replay the moment in his mind from the safety of a medical bay. He still wouldn't be entirely sure what happened. One second he was turning, victorious and unbothered. The next, his world became a confused blur of motion, leverage, and the peculiar sensation of weightlessness that even Vortheim instincts recognized as deeply wrong. What happened, in technical terms, was this. Thane converted her backward momentum into a pivot, dropped her center of gravity to something approaching floor level, and shot forward like a missile with a personal vendetta. Her shoulder hit Kryn's center mass just below his ribcage at the exact angle required to lift all 7'3" of apex predator off the mat. Her legs, those deceptively thin human legs that looked like they might snap in a strong breeze, drove upward with the kind of force that made physics sit up and pay attention. Her arms wrapped his torso, not gently, and her entire body became a lever with one simple purpose: to introduce Kryn to the concept of involuntary flight. He went up and up. The training hall's ceiling was 30 feet high, which turned out to be relevant because Kryn reached approximately 15 feet of altitude before gravity remembered it had a job to do. His trajectory was less graceful arc and more fired from a cannon, and his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and a dawning horror that would fuel nightmares for weeks. What goes up must come down, and Kryn came down hard. The impact-absorbing training mat was designed to handle punishment. It could withstand Vortheim falling from modest heights. It could absorb the impact of Kresh executing their famous crushing drops. It had been tested against every major species in the Academy and passed with flying colors. It was not designed for a 7'3", 300-pound apex predator hitting it at terminal velocity while wrapped in the grip of a human who apparently contained a fusion reactor where her core muscles should be. The mat didn't break exactly. It compressed, buckled, and created a Kryn-shaped crater that cracked the subfloor beneath it with a sound like a small explosion. Composite material designed to flex, instead, bent. Shock absorption systems that should have distributed the force across several square meters gave up and focused on preventing actual structural damage to the station. The medical drones, to their credit, were moving before Kryn even hit. They swarmed the impact site like mechanized hornets, scanners already cataloging damage, injectors loaded with species-appropriate painkillers and emergency coagulants. Thane rolled away from the impact, came up in a crouch, and immediately raised her hands in a non-threatening gesture toward Instructor Vex. Her breathing was elevated, but controlled, her expression showing mild concern, but no particular surprise at what had just happened. The training hall had gone absolutely silent. Kryn lay in his crater, staring at the ceiling, making a sound that might have been breathing or might have been his lungs remembering how breathing worked. One of the medical drones was already projecting a holographic damage report above his body. 3 fractured ribs, severe bruising across his back and torso, minor concussion, strained shoulder joint, and, most devastating of all, catastrophically damaged pride. Match to Corporal Kovac, Instructor Vex said into the silence, his voice admirably steady. Solid impact achieved. Medical drones, continue. Assessment and transport to medical bay as needed. Tillich's mandibles had frozen mid-click. The 2 Grishnar females stood with their mouths actually hanging open, which was impressive given their species' usual stoic composure. Every student in the hall was staring at either Thane or the crater, unable to quite process what their eyes had just reported. Thane walked to the edge of the mat, her movements careful and controlled. She looked down at Kryn, who had managed to focus his eyes enough to glare at her with the intensity of a dying star. "You pushed me," she said simply, as if this explained everything. Which, in a way, It did. Instructor Vex approached the crater, his eye stalks swiveling to take in the damage. Corporal Kovac, remain available for incident documentation. Cadet Vash, you're going to medical bay. What? Crin's voice came out as a wheeze. What are you? Thane tilted her head slightly, considering the question. Human, like the file says. Did you want my height and weight too? I can never remember if those are supposed to be in standard or Earth measurements. One of the medical drones injected something into Crin's neck that made his eyes go slightly unfocused. Good drugs, the kind that made pain a distant concept and existential crises manageable. 2 more drones deployed an anti-grav stretcher, carefully lifting him from his crater with the reverence usually reserved for archaeological artifacts. As they floated him toward the exit, Crin managed to raise one hand, pointing at Thane with a finger that shook slightly. That's not... Humans can't... Can't what? Thane asked, genuinely curious. Crin's hand dropped. That. The medical drones carried him away, leaving behind a crater, a confused class of advanced combat students, and a growing sense that perhaps the galaxy's understanding of human capabilities required some revision. Instructor Vex turned to address the remaining students, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen a lot of inexplicable things, but was still processing this particular item. Training is suspended for the remainder of rotation, while facilities evaluates the mat. Corporal Kovac, with me. The rest of you, dismissed. The students filed out in unusual silence, though Thane noticed several of them maintaining a notably wider distance from her than they had on the way in. Only Tillich paused at the door, his compound eyes reflecting light in a way that suggested he was reassessing several life choices. Corporal, he clicked. What would have happened if he had actually tried to hurt you? Thane considered this. Probably would have gone through the mat instead of just cracking it. Tillich's mandibles clacked once, sharply, and he left quickly. In Instructor Vex's office, a cramped space filled with commendations, incident reports, and what appeared to be a collection of confiscated weapons that he'd kept as trophies. Thane sat in a chair, designed for a species with a tail, while the instructor pulled up holographic documentation. I need your account of the incident, Vex said, his claws tapping at a data tablet. Standard procedure for any training injury requiring medical bay transport. Cadet Vaj pushed me during sparring, Thane said. I countered with a standard close combat grapple and takedown. He landed harder than expected. Vex's eye stalks swiveled to focus on her with unsettling intensity. Harder than expected. Corporal, you put a Vortheim through reinforced training composite. The facilities team is currently debating whether to repair the mat or just replace it entirely. The mat held, Thane pointed out. It's designed to absorb impacts. It absorbed an impact. It created a crater that violated 3 safety thresholds. But it held. Vex made a sound like air escaping a pressurized container. You understand this is going to generate questions. Humans are classified as a low-threat species for physical confrontation. You just hospitalized one of the Vortheim's top combat prospects. He pushed me first, Thane said, and there was something in her tone, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, that made Vex pause. Yes, he did. Why did he push you? Because he assumed I couldn't push back. Vex stared at her for a long moment. Can all humans do what you just did? Thane considered the question carefully. Depends on the training and the human. But yeah, roughly. I mean, I'm not particularly strong by human standards. I'm logistics, remember? I spend most of my time managing supply chains and filling out requisition forms. You're not particularly strong, Vex repeated slowly. There are humans in actual combat roles who'd make me look like a desk jockey, which, technically, I am. Thane shifted in the uncomfortable chair. Is this going to affect my certification status? I don't know, Vex admitted. I've never had to document a human putting a Vortheim in medical bay during routine sparring. It's not in the manual. There should probably be something in the manual about people pushing other people first, though, Thane suggested. Just as a general principle. Vex's claws stopped tapping. He studied the human corporal sitting in his office, looking remarkably unconcerned about having just rewritten several assumptions about interspecies combat dynamics. Why didn't you warn him? Warn him about what? That you could do that. Thane's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, Vex saw something that might have been actual annoyance. Instructor, I've spent 4 years having people assume I can't do things because I'm human. I've been given lighter loads because someone decided I was too fragile. I've been excluded from training exercises because someone thought I might get hurt. I've smiled through every humans are soft joke and every condescending warning about being careful around real warriors. She leaned forward slightly. So no, I didn't warn him. He pushed me because he thought there would be no consequences. That's not a training failure. That's an empathy failure. And I'm not responsible for managing someone else's incorrect assumptions about my capabilities. Vex's scales rippled in a pattern that indicated thoughtful consideration. That's fair, he admitted. But you realize this is going to change things. Things needed changing. Thane said simply. By the time second rotation came around, the story had spread through Zenith Academy with the kind of speed usually reserved for highly contagious diseases or really good gossip. The details varied wildly depending on who was telling it. Some versions had Thane throwing Kryn through the ceiling, others had her breaking him in half. But the core facts remained consistent. The human had slammed the Vortheim, and the Vortheim had lost. In the station's recreational areas, betting pools formed and dissolved around a single question. Was this a fluke, or were humans actually dangerous? In Medical Bay 3, Kryn Vaz contemplated this same question from the uncomfortable position of a healing pod. The medical drones had repaired his physical injuries with typical efficiency. Bones mended, tissues regenerated, concussion resolved. The injury to his worldview would take longer. He'd spent his entire life as an apex predator among apex predators. The Vortheim were the bar by which other species measured themselves. They were faster, stronger, more durable. They won fights because biology had spent millions of years ensuring they would win fights. And a human logistics officer who spent her days managing supply chains had launched him 15 feet into the air like he weighed nothing. The pod's door hissed open, and another injured student floated in on an anti-grav stretcher. Kryn recognized her. Nexus, a Felox from the advanced firearms class. Her right arm was in a regeneration sleeve. What happened to you? Kryn asked, grateful for any distraction from his thoughts. Nexus's eyes flickered with embarrassment. Hand-to-hand evaluation. Made the mistake of getting cocky with one of the human attachés from the diplomatic corps. Kryn sat up too quickly, winced, and settled back down. Another human did that? His name is Chen. Older guy, probably 50 by their years. Looks like someone's grandfather. I grabbed his wrist, figured I'd demonstrate a basic lock. She gestured at her injured arm. He did something. I still don't know what. And suddenly I was on the ground with a dislocated shoulder and the worst pain I've ever felt shooting up my arm. Did he apologize? profusely. Kept saying he reacted on instinct, helped me to medical, brought me flowers from the station's garden. Nexus laughed, though it sounded slightly pained. Apparently, he's a retired combat instructor from something called Marine Corps. When I asked what that meant, he said it was complicated. Kryn absorbed this information, adding it to the growing pile of evidence that suggested humanity's position in the galactic hierarchy might be based on catastrophically flawed assumptions. Another student entered, a Grishnar named Polvek, sporting regeneration gel across his torso. "Don't tell me," Kryn said. "Sparring accident. Human from the engineering department." Polvek settled onto a healing pad with a groan. She apologized afterward, said she forgot where she was for a second. Forgot where she was. Like the concept of being in an academy full of species stronger than her had just slipped her mind. "How many humans are at this academy?" Nexus asked. 23, Kryn said automatically. He'd checked the roster after his incident. 23 out of 4,000 students, all in support roles, administration, logistics, engineering, diplomacy. All supposedly non-combatant, Polvek added. The three of them lay in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications. "My grandfather," Kryn said slowly, "told me stories about the early contact years. He was part of the initial assessment teams when humans joined the galactic community. He said they seemed fragile, clumsy even. Walked into walls, tripped over their own feet, bruised if you patted them on the back too hard." "Sounds accurate," Nexus said. "But he also said something I didn't understand at the time. He said they moved like they were underwater, like they were pushing against something that wasn't there." Kryn paused. What if they weren't clumsy? What if they were compensating? Compensating for what? For being too strong? The silence that followed that statement was profound. Polvek finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I accessed some data files about Earth after my incident. Their homeworld has 1.4 times standard gravity. Everything there evolved under significantly higher weight than most developed species. Their atmosphere is denser. Their planet rotates faster, giving them shorter days. Even their moon is proportionally massive, creating tidal forces that affect their entire biology." "So," Nexus asked. "So, imagine growing up your entire life, wearing weights that are invisible to you. Every movement, every action, every physical task performed under conditions that are harder than what you will encounter almost anywhere else in the galaxy. Your muscles, bones, reflexes, all of them develop assuming that this is normal." Polvek shifted on his healing pad. "Then you leave your homeworld, and suddenly everything is easier. You're stronger, faster. The weight you've carried your entire life is gone." "They're not fragile," Kryn said, understanding flooding through him. "They're restraining themselves." "Every day," Polvek agreed. "Every interaction with other species. Every handshake, every training exercise, every casual contact. They're constantly recalibrating, holding back, because to them, the rest of us are the fragile ones." Nexus laughed, a sharp, slightly hysterical sound. "We've been treating them like children who might break. And they've been treating us like glass sculptures they're terrified of damaging. Until one of us pushes them," Kryn said quietly. "And they stop recalibrating." The medical drones continued their efficient work, repairing bodies while minds attempted to repair worldviews that had been thrown through metaphorical training mats. By third rotation, every species-specific chat channel at Zenith Academy was discussing the incident. The tone ranged from skeptical to worried to among some of the more thoughtful students, deeply curious. Several instructors found themselves fielding questions about human physiology that they were entirely unequipped to answer. In the Academy's main cafeteria, a space large enough to simultaneously feed students with wildly different biological requirements, Thane sat alone at a table designed for human proportions, working her way through a meal that looked disturbingly similar to what she'd eat on Earth. The galactic community had gotten quite good at synthesizing human-compatible food over the decades. She was aware of the stares, of course. Hard to miss when every species in the room was trying to look at her without looking like they were looking at her. Some were subtle about it, others not so much. A few tables had been abandoned entirely when she'd sat down, which she found more amusing than insulting. Tillich approached her table with the careful movements of someone approaching a potential explosive device. "May I sit, Corporal?" Thane gestured at the empty chairs. "Free station." The creche settled into a seat that accommodated his different body structure, his mandibles clicking softly in what she'd learned was a sign of nervous thought. I wanted to apologize. For what? For the countdown. For treating your match with Cadet Vash as entertainment. For assuming... He trailed off, mandibles clicking more rapidly. That I'd lose? Thane finished. Tillich, everyone assumed I'd lose, including probably Instructor Vex. It's fine. It's not fine, Tillich said firmly. It was disrespectful, and it was based on incorrect data. Thane took a bite of her synthesized protein, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed. Can I tell you something that's going to sound arrogant? Please. I wasn't trying very hard. Tillich's compound eyes reflected light in complex patterns. Explain. That throw? It's called a spear tackle. It's from a sport we play on Earth, several sports actually. Rugby, American football, other variations. It's a basic technique that children learn. I probably learned it when I was 12. She took a sip of water. The reason it worked so well is because Kryn outweighed me by, 150 pounds? More. But I'm from a high-gravity world, so my muscle density is higher than he expects. And I've been working in lower gravity for 4 years, so I'm stronger here than I would be on Earth. You're saying you're not even particularly skilled at combat. I'm logistics, Tillich. I manage supply chains. My hand-to-hand training is basic military stuff, just enough to qualify for deployment. There are humans who actually specialize in combat. She paused. Those people are scary. They'd make what I did to Kryn look gentle. Tillich was quiet for a long moment. How have we gotten this so wrong? Because we let you? Thane said simply. When humanity joined the galactic community, we were the new species. We didn't know the rules, didn't understand the social dynamics. When everyone decided we were soft and fragile, it was easier to just go with it. We got assigned to roles that played to other strengths. Organization, diplomacy, creative problem solving. And those roles are genuinely useful. But you're not soft. We're soft by our standards, Thane corrected. We've got thin skin. We don't have armor or scales or exoskeletons. We can be killed by falling wrong or eating the wrong thing or any number of stupid accidents. From our perspective, we are fragile. She smiled slightly. We just forgot that fragile is relative. Why didn't anyone tell us? Would you have believed them? Thane asked. Or would you have assumed they were exaggerating, being prideful, not understanding their place in the hierarchy? Tillich's mandibles went still. That's not a hypothetical question, is it? 3 years ago, a human engineer tried to warn a Vortheim instructor that the weight limit on a training dummy was based on standard gravity assumptions and might not account for human force application. The instructor laughed and told her to let the warriors worry about warrior things. Thane's expression remained neutral. The dummy broke. The engineer was written up for equipment damage. That's typical, Thane finished. It's been 80 years of that. So most humans have just learned to be careful, to hold back, to let other species feel strong and capable. It's easier than constantly explaining that no, we're not insulting you, yes. We really can lift that. And no, you really shouldn't test it. A shadow fell across the table. Both Thane and Tillich looked up to find Kryn Vaj standing there, looking significantly better than the last time she'd seen him, but still moving carefully. His amber eyes were unreadable. Corporal Kovac, may I speak with you? Thane gestured at another empty chair. Apparently it's becoming a popular table. Kryn sat, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, the Vortheim seemed to gather himself. I owe you an apology. You already apologized, Thane said. While they were loading you onto the stretcher, you apologized 6 times, actually. It was very thorough. I was medicated. This is the formal apology. Kryn's massive hands rested on the table, deliberately non-threatening. I treated you with disrespect. I made assumptions based on your species rather than your capability. I physically pushed you in what I thought was a harmless gesture, but was actually assault, regardless of intent. And I turned my back on an opponent during an active match, which is fundamentally incompetent. That's very comprehensive, Thane acknowledged. I've had time to think about it, and to talk with other students who have also miscalculated with human opponents. Kryn's expression was difficult to read, somewhere between embarrassed and determined. I'd like to request something. What? Training. With you. Thane blinked. You want me to train you? No. I want to train with you. To understand how humans fight, how you move, how you think about combat. Kryn leaned forward slightly. I've been training my entire life to fight opponents who are strong like I'm strong, fast like I'm fast. I've never fought someone who's strong in a different way, someone who's been compensating for gravity their entire life. Most of the time, I'm filling out requisition forms, Thane pointed out. And the rest of the time? Thane considered this. Around the cafeteria, she could see other students watching this conversation, trying to read its outcome. Some looked worried, like they expected another fight. Others looked curious. All right, she said finally. But we're using the reinforced mats, and you're buying the first round if we break anything. Kryn's expression, what she was learning to read as a smile in Vortheim features, was almost worth the inevitable paperwork. Agreed. Over the following weeks, Zenith Academy experienced what the administrators would later describe as a cultural readjustment period, and what the students called that time everyone realized humans are terrifying. It started with Kryn and Thane's training sessions, which drew crowds of curious students who wanted to see how a human actually fought when she wasn't worried about hurting someone. Thane demonstrated throws, locks, strikes, and combat techniques that didn't rely on being the biggest or strongest opponent, but instead used leverage, momentum, and the peculiar advantages of having bones and muscles evolve to fight gravity itself. The sessions were educational. They were also frequently punctuated by Kryn hitting various surfaces with considerable force, though the training mats held up better once facilities had installed the new reinforced versions. Other students began requesting similar training. The human attachés, administrators, and logistics officers, many of whom had military backgrounds from Earth, found themselves suddenly popular as sparring partners and instructors. Most were bemused by the attention but willing to help. Instructor Vex updated the Academy's training protocols to include specific guidelines for human sparring matches. The new rules included mandatory reinforced mats, stricter supervision, and a clause that essentially said, "Don't assume the human can't fight back," in more formal language. Someone updated the Academy's species database to reflect new information about human capabilities. The entry for humans still listed them as preferring diplomatic and logistical roles, but now included several strongly worded paragraphs about Earth's gravitational conditions, human bone density, and a warning that humans in standard or low-gravity environments operated at significantly higher physical capacity than initial assessments had indicated. The betting pools, which had initially formed around whether humans were actually dangerous, evolved into more sophisticated wagers about which species would figure this out next and how many students would end up in medical bay during the learning process. In her quarters one evening, Thane received a message from Earth, from her former commanding officer in the Orbital Defense Corps. The message was brief and characteristically dry. "Heard you threw someone through a floor. Proud of you. Try not to start an interstellar incident. Or do. Would be entertaining either way." She sent back an equally brief reply. "Floor held, mostly. Will try to restrain myself. No promises." The truth was, things had shifted at Zenith Academy in ways that went beyond just combat training. Students who had previously treated humans as background presence, useful for organizing things but not particularly interesting, began actually talking to them, asking questions, listening to answers. They learned that Earth's military history was violent and complex, spanning thousands of years of humans fighting each other with increasingly creative methods. They learned that humans had hundreds of martial arts, each developed for different purposes, different weapons, different philosophies. They learned that human sports often looked like barely controlled warfare, and that humans played them recreationally. They also learned quieter things, that humans had been holding back in dozens of small ways for 80 years. That the clumsiness early observers had noted was actually humans trying to learn how to exist in spaces where everything was more fragile than what they were used to. That the constant smiling wasn't stupidity or submission, but a calculated choice to seem non-threatening. That humanity had looked at the galactic community's hierarchies, its assumptions about strength and weakness, and had decided that being underestimated was safer than demanding recognition. It was a sobering set of realizations for species that prided themselves on their combat prowess. 3 months after the incident in Training Hall 7, Instructor Vex assembled his advanced combat class for their final evaluation. The class had changed significantly since that first rotation. More humans had been accepted into the combat certification program, and the existing students had developed a notably healthier respect for interspecies dynamics. Kryn Vash stood on the mat, fully healed and significantly humbler than he'd been at the beginning of the term. Across from him stood Thane Kovac, wearing the same calm expression she always wore and holding a certification tablet that would determine whether Kryn passed his advanced combat rating. "Standard evaluation rules," Instructor Vex announced. "Full contact sparring, 3 rounds, points for technique, strategy, and adaptability. Corporal Kovac will serve as examiner. Begin when ready." Kryn bowed, a formal gesture of respect that he'd never bothered with before. "Thank you for this opportunity, Corporal." Thane returned the bow. "Try not to land on your head this time. The medical drones get concerned." Despite himself, Kryn laughed. Then he settled into his stance, modified now, adjusted based on 3 months of learning how to fight someone who didn't fight like a wartime. The match began, and this time, both fighters were trying. Kryn was faster than he'd been, more adaptable. He'd learned to watch for shifts in weight distribution, to not assume that size advantage meant automatic victory, to treat every opponent as potentially capable, regardless of their species designation. Thane was still Thane, calm, methodical, and utterly unbothered by the fact that she was fighting someone who could bench press a shuttle. She moved like water, like gravity, like someone who had spent her entire life negotiating with physics and had learned all its loopholes. The match went all 3 rounds. Kryn landed several solid techniques. Thane countered with precision rather than power. When it ended, both fighters were breathing hard, and the crater count was 0. "Pass," Thane said, entering the evaluation into her tablet. With commendation for adaptive learning and significantly improved spatial awareness. Kryn straightened, touching his knuckles to his forehead in the wartime gesture of genuine respect. "Thank you, Corporal, for the evaluation and for the lesson about assumptions." Which lesson was that? That strength comes in different packages, that being underestimated can be a choice, and that pushing someone without understanding who they are is a really good way to end up in a crater. Thane smiled, and there was something in that expression that the other students had learned to recognize, the look of someone who had been holding back for a very long time and had finally been given permission to stop. "Good lessons," she agreed. "Try to remember them." That evening, in the Academy's observation lounge, Thane stood at the viewport, looking out at the stars that humanity had joined 80 years ago. Behind her, she could hear the usual sounds of students relaxing after classes, conversations in a dozen different languages, the click of creche mandibles, the rumble of wartime laughter, the high-pitched whistles of Philox communication. And now, occasionally, the sound of humans being treated as equals rather than oddities. Tillich approached, carrying 2 containers of the fermented beverage his species preferred. He offered one to Thane, who accepted it despite knowing it would taste like carbonated plant matter to her human palate. "I've been thinking," the creche said, settling beside her at the viewport. "Dangerous habit. About what you said. About humanity letting us underestimate you." Tillich clicked thoughtfully. Was it really safer? Or was it just easier? Thane took a sip of the terrible beverage, considering her answer. Maybe both. When you're the new species, proving yourself feels like a challenge, like you're asking for a fight. Letting everyone assume you're not a threat means they don't see you as competition. But they also don't see you as equals. No, Thane agreed. They don't. But equality isn't given, Tillich. It's taken. Sometimes gently through diplomacy and patience, and sometimes, she smiled slightly, through a training mat. Tillich's mandibles formed the creche equivalent of a grin. "I notice you haven't broken anything in almost a week." "I'm restraining myself. It's very difficult." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel past the viewport. Somewhere in the Academy, medical drones were probably treating someone who had decided to test their theory about human capabilities. Somewhere else, betting pools were forming around tomorrow's sparring matches. And in training halls throughout the station, humans and other species were learning to see each other as they actually were, rather than as their assumptions dictated. Progress, Thane thought, came in many forms. Sometimes it was diplomatic, sometimes it was through careful negotiation and cultural exchange. And sometimes, apparently, it was through slamming an apex predator through a training mat hard enough to crack the subfloor. She could live with that. Above them, Zenith Academy continued its slow orbit, home to thousands of students learning the ancient arts of combat, strategy, and, occasionally, humility. The galaxy's military elite trained in its halls, growing stronger, faster, more capable. And among them, humans quietly existed, managing logistics, organizing supplies, filling out requisition forms, and occasionally reminding everyone that fragile was a matter of perspective. The galaxy's hierarchies remained, for the most part, intact. The Vortime were still apex predators. The Kresh still had their exoskeletons. The Talvek still had their experience. But now, when someone mentioned humans, the response wasn't dismissive laughter or condescending patience. Now, the response was respect, and perhaps just a touch of healthy wariness. After all, you never knew when a logistics officer might decide to stop compensating for gravity